Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for yet another Startup Saturday with all our Head Start hubs. I was just like 2 minutes back talking to Abhishek about Head Start hubs and what exactly Head Start hubs are. So Abhishek, just to continue that, like I said, Head Start hubs are an alliance between Head Start and the top 12 innovation centers in the country. So right from an AIC SMU in Sikkim to an AIC NDRI in Bangalore to two AICs in Odisha and Rajasthan, Delhi, Hyderabad, Chennai, and we'll be adding more to the list very very soon. But most of the participants that we have today here are based out of one of these AICs, and yeah, we're really really happy to have you here today. And for a change, because I've been usually hosting these sessions, so I thought a good change for the hubs as well, that I'll ask Pranay to moderate the session today, so these guys will also get a bit of change. So that's where we're at. Over to you, Pranay.
Thank you, Vanya. Thank you so much for this. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday. It's always so nice to see such a huge bunch of people, coming up and joining on Saturday and learning so much, right? It's always nice. So it's been a great week for the startup world, especially with Zomato listing. So uh, nice to sort of be doing this. So I'll probably delve right into it. Today we have Abhishek with us. Uh, just to introduce him, I'll just take a couple of minutes to introduce him. So, I often opine that there are these founders who solve certain problems, which are those problems which people did not even know they had, or they did not know that those problems need solving, right? And those are the founders who really make it. And to be honest, I think Abhishek is one such founder who is sort of disrupting a very interesting sector, and it's great to see the kind of work they've done so far. So a bit more about Abhishek. So I was going through his profile for this, and I felt so intimidated. I felt like I need one session to introduce Abhishek itself. But to keep it short, so Abhishek is an IIT and a Stanford grad, and he's worked across the board with Google, with Digit. He's been a part of multiple startups as part of the founding team. Before Plum, he was with Hypertrack, which is another very interesting startup, which I heard of long time back as well. And for the last couple of years, he's been building Plum. Plum is basically a health insurance tech platform, and they're aiming at democratizing health insurance access with cheaper, innovative products, across the board, going for the B2B2C model. The most recent news about Plum is that they have raised a check of $15.6 million as part of the Series A funding from names like Tiger and Sequoia within a span of 2 years, right? So I'm really excited for this session ahead. It'll be lovely to know, what Abhishek has been doing, and how is it that he's been able to crack such an interesting market with so much traction. Thank you, Abhishek, so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to host you, and it's honestly a privilege to host you as well. So probably, we can just start by you giving a brief introduction about yourself, about Plum, and then we can take it from there.
Hey Pranay, first of all, thank you so much for inviting. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to meet all the entrepreneurs that have been devoting their lives to follow their passion to build what they really want. So it's a privilege to be talking to each of the founders that we have here. Yeah, we started Plum almost a year and a half ago. Pranay, as you mentioned, it's a problem that we didn't realize. I think that's a great articulation, and I think I truly believe that a lot of very large companies can be built in the markets which I call as sleepy markets. Right, these are markets that are so huge and so traditional, and that has existed for such a long time that you get used to it and you never realize that hey, there is just a very large market and this can be disrupted, right? Imagine, you were talking about Zomato. Imagine just going out and getting your food around 15 years ago.
Yeah.
People would have never imagined that hey, there can be a revolution in food, right? And people came in and built 10 billion, $15 billion companies just in food tech, right? So I'm always passionate about these kind of industries. I think, so there are two kinds of problems that you can solve generally. One is you can go and build a completely new industry that never existed, and think of a Facebook, think of a LinkedIn, think of a social network or a professional network. You're building a new market, and you don't know how that will pan out. Very high risk, but a very, very high return, of course. And the second market is a market that existed, very highly inefficient, very large, but highly inefficient market. You just need to execute really well in that market to build innovation and to do a 10x better job in that market, right? So that's what we are doing with Plum. With Plum, the reason we started Plum was because of three core theses that we had. One, health insurance in India is going through a fundamental shift in this decade. We have close to a 20% kind of penetration, but our strong bet is that in this decade, in the next 10 years, by 2030, this 20% can actually go to as high as 80% penetration of health insurance in India. And India could be very similar to a lot of other countries, right? Be it US, be it European countries, or any of the Asian countries, where health insurance is almost like a roti kapda makan. If you live in that country, you need to have a health insurance. So India will see that kind of transformation as well. And COVID has massively accelerated that kind of awareness, that kind of need that existed in the market. Number two, we are not a rich country where everyone can afford health insurance on their own. The penetration of retail health insurance is very small, and it will remain to be really small. Even if we get 10% of the population to buy their health insurance, it's a large number. We are talking about 150 million people having health insurance on their own, which means the large segment of Indian population will have to be supported through some other means, either through the government sponsored health insurance or the employers buying health insurance for their own. And that's our second bet, that Indian health insurance penetration will actually largely happen through these two means, which is government and the employers. And again, if you draw parallels from any other country, you will see the exact same trend. Any of the countries that you pick up that has a high penetration of health insurance, the retail penetration is very, very small in single digit. Most of the penetration has happened because of the employer health insurance or the government health insurance. And India won't be any different. And our third thesis was, all the innovation in India has happened in the retail health insurance space. No one has actually touched the corporate health insurance space. Health insurance anyways is a sleepy market, but even if you break down health insurance, people got more attracted towards retail and not the corporate health insurance. Corporate health insurance has been the same for the last 2 decades, right from how you purchase it to how your employees understand your insurance to how they make a claim. So that was the reason we started Plum, which is, hey, there is a large market which is growing at a much faster pace. The segment that will grow at a much faster pace is the corporate market, and no one is actually doing any kind of innovation. So can we actually start reimagining the entire employer-employee health insurance and make it really accessible? When I say accessible, think of companies as small as 5 employees to companies as large as 5,000 employees being able to set up a health insurance, making it really affordable. And when I say really affordable, it means it should be as cheap as, let's say, 80 rupees an employee per month, which is less than a cost of a meal for an employee, right?
Absolutely.
And then making it really high quality experience for the employees and the companies to use it. So that's what we are building with Plum.
Nice. That's very interesting. I love the way you put those 3 pointers, right? And how you're going after a market which seems to be a mature market, but at the same time is not so mature, and there's a lot of scope for disruption over there. And which brings me back to the thesis that I was mentioning earlier. Thank you for that. So a bit more sort of delving a bit deeper into this whole aspect, right? So you did mention about why you're doing Plum and what is the idea behind it. Can you take me to the thought process? For example, let's take yourself, right? You were with Google earlier, then you were with Hypertrack, which are 2 very different industries. You were with Digit earlier. Hypertrack, I think, is logistics. So what is it that pushed you to, okay, let me think about insurance, health insurance in India and B2B? I mean, that's like, and even your founding team, right? Like I did look at it, and most of you have very diverse backgrounds and not necessarily insurance. So why this sector? In the sense that what was the thought process that went behind it?
No, that's a great question actually. And I think that's one of the areas where we as founders, we as entrepreneurs give a lot of weightage to the industry experience. And I think if you are trying to disrupt a very old traditional industry, that industry experience in general will hurt you rather than help you, because it will bound you to the ways the industry has operated in the past, and that is actually the primary reason why innovation hasn't happened. So to give you an example, when we started thinking of insurance, we actually met a lot of leaders in the industry, and almost everyone said, hey, you guys should not build this. You are going after something that doesn't need disruption or cannot be disrupted, right? Right from, so for example, one of the things that we were trying to change was, hey, why do companies that are greater than 100 people only get insurance? Why can't a 10 people company get an insurance? And when he spoke to industry leaders, they had 10 different reasons of why this is not possible. And if someone from the industry would have built it, in the back of their mind, they would know that this is not possible, right? I think that's one of the core things that we need to understand as an entrepreneur, that it's actually very helpful for you to be an outsider in the industry, because that way, one, you will have very first principles thinking of problem solving. You're just asking very simple problems, right? Very simple questions that, hey, I mean, if 100 people company can get an insurance, why not a 10 people, right? And then you're just trying to peel the onion and figure out, just keep asking the whys, right, of every answer that you get. And eventually you'll be able to get to an answer of how to solve it. So I would say industry experience is overrated. What is underrated is actually the functional experience. When you're building a team, and that's what you would see in our team as well. We have some of the really good leaders, including my co-founder. They bring in the functional experience of building really high quality products, building very solid engineering, very solid operations, very solid people team, for example, right? For solving anything or for building anything meaningful, you basically need that functional experience, and just combine that with first principles thinking. And that's how we are thinking about Plum, which is we actually try to ensure that more than 80% of our team doesn't have industry background, so that we always are challenging the status quo. And we sprinkle it with people, let's say 20% people from the industry background, so that we are not learning the basics, right? We still have some of the basics covered. Why insurance? I think it was the core thesis that we talked about, right? For us, we wanted to solve something that is meaningful, that is impactful, and that is large. So we figured out the problem statement. And Saurabh is my co-founder, Saurabh and I spoke very early about this, that, hey, let's use this as an advantage that we don't come from the industry. Let's use this as an advantage to build something meaningful. And if you see all the large insurtech companies that have been built globally as well, right? If you look at the top 5 insurtech companies in the US, you will see every single founding team are people that have zero insurance background. It's a very, very common trait. And insurance is just an example. You pick up any other industry as well. Pick up logistics, right? People that are disrupting logistics will have zero logistics background.
Yeah.
So I think if you're trying to disrupt a very old, sleepy industry, it's better that you're coming from outside the industry.
Lovely. I love the insights that you gave here, right? It takes me back to this thing that, if you have the ability to ask the right questions, and there is nothing that can stop you from, achieving, or let's say solving what you want to solve. And a lot of stuff that you said about first principles thinking and functional experience really goes back to, I'm not sure if you follow Naval Ravikant, but I do listen to some of his stuff, and I am reading his almanac as well. And this was like literally talking to Naval Ravikant, because he keeps talking about first principles every time, right? In fact, whoever's in the audience, if you guys haven't checked out Naval Ravikant, please go look him up. There is a bunch of podcasts he's done with Tim Ferriss. You would really benefit from it. Anyway, moving on. Thank you for that as well. So I think the next question, before, again, I have something again on the insurance sector, but before that, a little bit more of a not so serious question would be, why is it called Plum? When you could name it anything, you have called it Plum. So why is it called Plum?
Yeah, I'll give you a funny answer and a serious answer. The funny answer is that we were 30 years late. We couldn't get Apple, so the next best option was Plum.
I think that's a great answer.
But the real answer, the real story is, see, when you are building a company, and especially in an industry like insurance, you want to build a very high very high recall of your company. People should be see, people when they go to the hospital, right, they need to very quickly remember that, hey, I have this insurance, right? If it's a name that's hard to remember, if you come up with a fancy name, a word that didn't exist, people will have a very hard time to remember, right? And then in a way, you are basically building discomfort to your end users who want to use it. So our very one of the basic requirements that we had when we were thinking of company name was that, hey, it should be a word that exists, that people use in their day-to-day life. So we narrowed down on, hey, that we'll use some fruit names or vegetable names. I mean, some of these categories, right? Just very generic categories that, hey, these are names that people will easily remember because they're using it in their day-to-day life. Our second reason was, hey, it should be just a short 3-4 letters kind of name. Again, easy to remember, easy to type, right? Third, you should have a domain available in the 2020s. You can't build a business that is not online. So it should have a domain available. So those were the three reasons, or those were the three filters that we were applying. I think this just came, this idea or this name came almost in the midnight to us that, hey, why not Plum? And the reason it stuck with us is, see, every time you think about, in a common saying, right, you say, hey, I got a plum job, which signifies that it's something that you really appreciate, you really like, right? You aspire, right? It's an aspirational job, right? So we wanted to bring that concept to your health benefits as well. That, hey, you got, what if 10 years later people start saying, hey, I got a plum benefits, right? Which signifies that you have got a really high quality health insurance and a health benefit program from your employer. So that's the reason we actually, the company name is Plum Benefits. And what we are building is beyond insurance as well, right? What we are building essentially is a health benefit platform that an organization can use to build a health benefit program for their employees. And health insurance is the starting point. They start with health insurance, but they will build an entire healthcare program for their employees and their family members.
Lovely, lovely. You know, every answer that you're giving is like a quick masterclass on certain things. Like this was a masterclass on how to name your company. So really good stuff. I love the thesis that gone behind it. So moving on, I think a bit more on the insurance sector. I think probably the last point on that particular aspect of it is, see, financial services as such, right? You take NBFCs, banking, insurance, markets. All of these are pretty heavily regulated for obvious reasons. Like there'll be one regulated by RBI, like insurance is regulated by the IRDA, right? And with regulation, there does come some complexities in terms of, you know, how you would operate, how your financials would look like, a lot of things which come under compliance and risk management, all of those things, right? So, so what were some of the challenges which you faced when disrupting a regulated sector like insurance, and how did you go about that?
Definitely. So I think two things that you should remember. One, regulation can definitely be a challenge to start. It can have a very high friction when you are starting something, but it can also become a moat for you over time, right? Because that means that once you have overcome that challenge, then it's not easy for someone else to penetrate into that industry the way you have done that. So everything that, I mean, whenever you think about regulation, think about it as a two-sided sword, right? It's giving you some advantage at the end of the day. Number two, when you're thinking about a regulated sector where it's not easy to get a license, and this applies in insurance, but this also applies in banking. It also applies in lending, every single industry, right, where you have this regulation. One of the approaches that you have to take is, see, either you say that, hey, I'll go all in and I'll get my license, and unless I get my license, I won't do anything, right? And then you can wait for 10 years just waiting for the license and nothing would happen. The other approach is you go and build partnerships in the ecosystem and move really fast with the like-minded partners. And that's the approach that we took, which is we got a license to distribute insurance from IRDA, but not manufacture. And for the manufacture part, for the underwriting part, we went and partnered with the insurance companies that were very like-minded in terms of how we are thinking, what is our vision, what is our end goal, and they wanted to build this along with us. Saying that, it's a very difficult thing to achieve, right? Getting an insurance company, getting that first insurance company, for example, it took us 6 months. When we had this idea to build Plum, to getting the first insurance company to sign a contract, it took 6 months. To get the second company, it took 2 months. To get the third company, it took 2 weeks. And now every company is ready to, or basically wants to work with Plum, right? They're reaching out to us and they want to work with Plum. And that's the advantage that you build over time. But I think that's a patience that you need to have early on, that, hey, if you're building in a regulated industry, you have to think of the ecosystem, you have to think of a partnership approach, and you have to have very high amount of patience to get that first partner on board, right? It's happened with banking as well. If you look at all the neobanks that have been coming up, right? Be it Jupiter or Fi or Neo, each one of them took almost 2 years, 2.5 years to go live, because again, they need to get a partner and they need that partner to work with them to build products along with them. So I think that will be true if you're building anything in a regulated sector, and especially in the fintech segment.
Right. Well, very interesting. So I think one of the key traits of any founder, right, if a founder needs to really get by, is perseverance. You have to be perseverant. You have to sort of be patient, and that is tested double the intensity when you're building a fintech platform. So good stuff. So moving on a little more into Plum as an organization, right? So I'm sure that, when you started off, it was not just you, and you had a whole team that you had, and you were going about building, because you had to scale up along with building a team. So how difficult was it, or how easy was it, or rather, how did you go about building a founding team, and what were some challenges you faced there, and how did you overcome that?
No, absolutely. I think before you think about the founding team, the first thing that you need to think about is the founders. Who is your co-founder? I think that's a very, very important decision for every entrepreneur in the room. It's, I would say, not as important, probably more important than your marriage in a way. You're going to spend more time with your co-founder.
It's going to be a messy divorce if it happens. So.
Yeah, and that will impact, a divorce can impact just you and your spouse. This divorce can impact a team of 100,000 people and the customers, right? In a way. So be very, very sure about who that co-founder is. Spend a lot of time. For example, Saurabh and I spent almost 5-6 months figuring out, in a way, dating, right? And figuring out, hey, we want to do this together. We are doing this for the right reasons and for a very similar reason. And we are both aligned to that common vision of what we want to build. So I would say that's the number one thing that you need to remember. Just spend a lot of time thinking about that co-founder. With respect to founding team, it's always a work in progress in a way. But I would say you need to find people who are really passionate about what you're building. Be sure that you don't get, especially in the early team, right? In the first 15, 20 people, don't get anyone who's coming in, let's say, for a salary or for a salary hike, right? One of the things that we did was we had a very simple filter. Hey, if you can't take a cut in your salary, which means you are not, you don't have enough belief in our vision and mission, and you are just coming into Plum thinking about a salary hike or just as a job, right? Just be sure, put that filter, and whatever that filter, right? I mean, that can be some other filter that you would want to personally apply, but apply some filters to make sure that your founding team is coming in for the right reasons, which is that they believe in you as a leader. They believe in your vision and mission. They believe in what you're trying to change, because that's a team that you would want to stay with you for a very, very long period of time. And I would say that's you also asked how easy or difficult it was. I mean, I think in retrospect, it feels easy, but at the time when we were doing it, it was extremely difficult to assemble that team. Now, obviously, the things that we are doing, the next thing that you're doing always feels harder. And hence in retrospect, it looks like, okay, now that we have done it, looks easy, but it was extremely difficult.
Right. No, that's great insight again, right? So again, it takes me to the principle of, being really clear on the why. There's this really exciting book called Start with Why by Simon Sinek, and it's like it's phenomenal, right? Like if you're very clear on the reasons for which you're doing certain things and your motivators are right, then you have it. Also, just got a great.
I would just one very practical advice. I would say just for the first 20-30 people, don't even think of having an HR team. You should be the HR. You should be spending all the time in terms of sourcing those talent and doing the interviews and hiring them. And then for the first 50-100 people, you can have HR, but make sure that you're meeting everyone and you're evaluating everyone one-on-one to make sure that you are still getting in the right kind of people. And then you can let your leadership team do what you are doing, right? By that time, you would have built a leadership team that you trust enough and that will do the same kind of filtering that you would have done otherwise.
Right. No, absolutely. That's very relevant. So in fact, since you mentioned the analogy of dating and marriage, has got a great idea that there could be a Bumble for co-founders. So just dropping it out there, anybody who wants to take it can take it, else I might end up doing it myself. Anyhow, so moving on to the next one. But before I do that, so the audience is really free to ask any questions that they want. You can, bump up on the chat. You can give your comments, anything that you want to say, any thoughts you have. I'll keep looking at the chat every few minutes. And, if there's something that I'll probably bring it up. So feel free to sort of write stuff, ask any questions that you may have for Abhishek. No worries at all. So moving on to the next one, right? So, okay, now we've spoken about the team, but let's talk about the king over here, which is the customer. So how do you go about, getting, so you mentioned it took you 6 months, right? So during this entire time, what was it that happened that made you convert that first customer, right? More so considering that, this is a sector which is heavily penetrated in terms of the traditional sense, right? So what was the value proposition that you offered that made them go for you?
Yeah, so I'll answer this in two components. One is the kind of customer segment that you go after, and second is the process, right? So when you're thinking about your customers, be very sure about who is your ideal customer, right? So when you think about health insurance, again, it could be, you can go after retail customer, you can go after corporates, right? We went after corporates. Now within corporates, there are hundreds of different kinds of corporates that you can go after. You can go after a kirana shop. It's again, think of this as a business, right? You can go after a small accounting service firm. You can go after a startup of 50 people. You can go after a small enterprise of 500 people, or you can go after an Infosys with 100,000 people. Segment your market and make sure that you know which is the market, which is a segment that needs your product the most. For us, we figured out that the first segment that we want to go after is companies that are 10 to 100 employees and companies that are more tech first. The two reasons were, one, these were the companies that actually were not served or underserved by the existing players in the segment, right? So we were actually going after an underserved segment and we didn't have competition. So competition was not an issue. For us, what we were solving was actually, can we build a product that can serve this market? And the second reason was because these were tech first, they were ready to experiment with us. They're not companies that would say, hey, you build everything and your product should be mature and then we will think about it, right? So that's the point on segmentation. In terms of the process, and this is, I again, think of this as a tip to all the entrepreneurs. I would say before you are starting, make sure you're talking to as many potential customers as possible, as many companies as possible. We spoke to almost 80 companies. These are founders or HR leaders, to build a thesis and to finalize that this is what we are building. And when you're talking to these customers, see, if you're talking to customers, most of the times they'll be your direct friends or friends of friends, right? And a very typical culture in India is no one wants to upset you. So they'll say, yeah, whatever you're building is good. I'll use your product whenever it's ready, right? Because they don't want to upset you. I would say ask that hard question. Tell them that, hey, your product is ready. Are you ready to give me your credit card right now? That's a true test, right? If they say, that's when they will say, oh, no, 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 I have this reason I can't use this. Oh, because your product doesn't have this, I can't use this. Or, hey, I can't pay this and hence I can't use this, right? So that's the right question to ask. So I think two things that I would say. One is talk to as many customers as possible. Number two, make sure you're getting the right signals, right? And to get the right signals, you have to ask some of the hard questions that, hey, are you ready to swipe your credit card today if I have the product? So for example, at Plum, out of those 80 people that we spoke to, we had at least 20 companies that said, yes, I am ready to give my credit card right now. If you had the product, I'm ready to use it right now, right? So as soon as we started building, we have a list of customers that were ready to use it. And within the first 2 to 3 months, we were able to onboard those 15, 20 pilot customers that we had spoken to. And that gave us a head start to what we wanted to build. And in a way, we actually built the product with these customers. We spoke to them, every single feature that we built and launched, we launched it along with these pilot customers.
Nice, interesting. Great insights over there as well, right? Like the importance of doing a thorough market research before you really go to market, and also segmenting your market to see which are the ones who are more likely to adopt your product. Good stuff there as well. So I think the next thing again in terms of probably customers and so let's say I got my first customer. So the next is I start scaling up. So like you said, right, it took 6 months and then 2 months, and now within a day, let's say you get one customer. Along with so I'm sure that at some point you started seeing, okay, what, now this is getting really big, and especially considering that in 2 years you have grown leaps and bounds. There would have been that point of time where you saw that, okay, fine, now this is really scaling up and I need to also prep up my backend accordingly, right? So how did you go about that? Did you have to pivot? Did you have to change something significantly? What was your scale up strategy from a backend perspective? Front end is something which is which is out there, but backend is something which most people struggle with. So how did you manage that?
Yeah, so I think for us, there were 3 aspects to making sure that we can scale this business. One is we really need to have a tech product. When we got these customers, these were essentially, think of these as just a bunch of mocks that we would build on Figma and show it to them, and or basically send out a presentation and say, hey, this is what our product looks like, right? But we didn't have a real product. So how do you build that real product? And to build that product, you need a very solid engineering team to build that. And when it's a solid engineering team, it doesn't really mean a large engineering team. It was actually just 2 people who were building out the products. But we were glad that these were people who were really committed and built really high quality products, including my co-founder. So one is product and engineering. You need to have really high quality product and engineering. Second is when you are, and especially in the business of insurance, you have a high amount of operations that is involved, right from how you onboard a customer to how you service their insurance claims, or just any of their ad hoc needs. And this is, see, what you have to realize is, and this is one of the mistakes that a lot of other founders do as well, is you try to over-engineer your product on day one without having a single customer, right? You don't have to solve everything on day one. You can actually solve a lot of these things in the early days using operations. Just put people behind it. And the reason to do that is by putting people behind it, you're figuring out what are the real problems to be solved and how to solve it. And then at a later point in time, you can actually use your product and engineering to solve those problems in a more productized way. But what we had to do in that scheme of things was build that high quality operations team. And we were lucky to have a leader, Debanko, who joined us. He's actually one of the guys who bring in that 15, 20 years of insurance experience. He had set up insurance companies in multiple countries, and he decided to come and build Plum with us, but he started building operations for Plum. And the third is, as we start scaling up, see the first 30, 40, 50 companies, it was essentially us, the co-founders, who were going and doing all the sales, right? 100% of the sales. But if your goal is to scale from 50 to 500 companies to 1,000 to 5,000 companies, you need to start building your sales and marketing muscle that can scale this engine for you. So you need to start building that back end of sales team as well and start building that processes around sales. So those were the three core things that meant for us. As we started doing the sales operations and product engineering, you would have to then start thinking of, and this goes back to the previous point, right? When I said, hey, start with a very small segment of customers, right? But when you're starting with a small segment of customer, at some point in time, you will exhaust that customer base very quickly, right? So then you have to start thinking, hey, what is the next set of customers that you can go after, right? So start thinking of, hey, what's the segment 2? What's the segment 3? What's the segment 4? And take those measured approaches in each of these segments. When you go into each of these segments, your product may need to change, your sales approach may need to change, your operations approach may need to change, but you need to start thinking about those segments as well.
Nice, interesting. This again reminds me of something. So I read somewhere that running a startup is like, building a plane, assembling a plane while flying it. And it's exactly sort of what you laid out here, right? With your second point. So thank you for that. Again, I think, so the next thing that I would want to go on to is the thing that has been making all the buzz, right? The fundraise. So congratulations on the fundraise. While I know that, while the fundraise is definitely a huge thing, the next challenge is to really scale up, use it, and sort of grow from there. So I am cognizant of that, but nevertheless, it's a huge milestone, especially coming from such marquee investors. So congratulations on that. So so a little bit on what is since you've been able to raise these funds within this 2 year of operations, what is your biggest lesson from fundraising, right? And another thing, a related question would be, see, the business that you're building, I'm imagining it would have a very positive unit economics of sorts, right? Because your product has been built, your software has been built, and it's connecting two people, and you take a cut, and of course, the unit economics is pretty much sorted. So there is an option to grow bootstrapped and to sort of go self-sustainably as well. So what was it that made you decide, what, let's go for a funding, because that is what's going to help us go propel 100x. And what was some of the biggest lessons that you had from this entire fundraising exercise?
No, absolutely. So let me answer that in 2 steps, which is the fundraising process and learnings, and then why fundraise at all.
Right.
So in the first part, see how it happened with Plum was actually we have done 3 rounds of fundraising. Fortunately, all of these were inbound interest from our investors. All of them actually closed within a few weeks. Most of the time, these fundraising can go on for months or quarters, sometimes years as well. But fortunately, all of these closed very, very quickly. And what really worked was these inbound interest from investors came because these investors heard about Plum from their own portfolio companies who were using Plum in the first place. And these portfolio companies were really delighted that Plum existed and Plum is solving a genuine problem for them. Think of companies like, you talked about Tiger Global, for example, right? So these were companies like Grow or Unacademy. These were actually portfolio companies of, or Clevertap. These are portfolio companies of Tiger Global. And that's how they heard about Plum. And that's how they actually got introduced and started talking to us. The advantage that you have, if that's how the fundraising happens, is you don't have to explain the market and your product to the customer, to the investor anymore, right? Because they have heard it from the people they trust the most, which is their portfolio companies. Now, the only thing that you need to explain to them that, hey, this is the right team to back, right? You have already solved the problem of market and the or the customer pain point and the product part. So it becomes really, really easy if that's how you approach the funding, which is you build something, your customers really like it, and your customers are talking about your product. And that goes, and that basically would be my advice as well to all the entrepreneurs, which is focus more on building the right product, solving a genuine problem in a way that your customers can't stop talking about your product. And this is applicable both in B2B or B2C, right? If you have solved something genuinely, your investors will find about you as a company and the product that you have built. And especially in this very heated market that we exist right now, right? Your investors will find out, right? So I would say focus on product building and solving the customer pain point and not on the fundraising, and fundraising will happen automatically.
Very interesting. Yeah.
On the second one, on why why fundraise versus bootstrap, I think it's a widely debated topic. No right or wrong answer, right? You can
Which is
build.
why I wanted your perspective on it. It'll be nice to see another perspective.
I think you can build. See, there is no right or wrong answer, right? You can build companies in both the ways. It just depends on who you are as a co-founder and what kind of company you would want to build. So I think as a business model, it is actually possible for us to bootstrap and build this. It would take much more time for us to build this company if we take that approach, but the end result could be very similar, right? But it will just take much more time versus taking a fundraise, which will get us to that endpoint much faster. But there is a downside to it, right? The downside is that you will own much smaller part of that company eventually. I think that's pros and cons that you as a founder need to evaluate when you are taking that decision. For us, we are okay with that downside, and we wanted to build something really fast and that would scale up really fast and solve a much larger problem in a shorter amount of time, right? And when I say shorter amount of time, it will still take us 10 years, but instead of, let's say, taking 20-25 years, maybe we can accelerate that in the next 5 to 10 years. So that was a simple logic for us. There is no other complicated maths.
No, absolutely. I think I totally buy into this philosophy, right? While there is a lot of literature out there, let's just put that out of the window and let's go to first principles again. So it's always about, what is the time frame that you're looking at for a certain growth vision that you have, and especially in today's market, in the world that we live in, it is somewhere important to sort of go fast, right? Fail fast, get up fast, do things fast. So that part of it is there, but of course there is even bootstrapping. So again, it's a never-ending argument. So I think moving on from this, just one more thing on the fundraise. Let's say there is somebody who is a first-time entrepreneur who is looking at fundraising. It could be at an angel stage or a seed stage or even Series A stage. What is that one advice that you would give to that person so that they go with the right mindset and they are able to sort of see through it?
No, it's the same. I'll just repeat myself. Focus on building the product and solving something genuine. Okay. Fundraise should not be your first goal. Fundraise should be an outcome of what you are building. If you are not solving anything genuinely, no matter what you do, you'll be able to build up a nice story, a great presentation. Maybe you're able to get the first angel round or a seed round, but eventually it won't work out, right? So focus on the right things. Fundraising it's just an input metric into what you're trying to build, right? It's not the output.
Right. Absolutely. No, I totally agree with that. Okay, so just another question. I guess this will also be a shorter answer because we've covered most of it. But just to sort of pinpoint things, right? So when you're scaling a business, right? Let's take 3 pillars. There is funding, there is talent, and there is execution. So out of these 3 pillars, would you place a higher weightage in any one of these, or would you feel these are equally weighted, or how would you rate them?
Yeah, I would say execution is number 1. Talent is number 2, and funding is just an input, right? So execution followed by talent. See, everyone eventually has a really good idea. Early on, you and your co-founder, and maybe if you have a small founding team, you really need to execute and prove out product market fit. If you do that, that'll help you get your team. It will help you attract the right kind of talent if you have proved that you can execute as the founding team or as the founders, and it will also get you the funding, right? So execution is the most important part. Let's say you get team, right? You get talent and you get funding. Again, if you are not good at execution, they actually don't mean anything, right? Those eventually will become dead if you are not able to execute. So execution, then talent, then funding.
Nicely put. Okay, so again, another serious, not serious question. So for all the people who know Bollywood out there, you must be aware of the movie Nayak, where Anil Kapoor was CM for a day, right? So let's presume I'm Anil Kapoor and Abhishek is the CM. So how does a day in the life of Abhishek look like? Let's say today I was to live a day in your life. What would it look like for me?
Yeah, so that answer changes actually at every phase of the startup. if you are in a 0 to 1 kind of phase, right? If you had asked me this question, let's say a year ago, my 80% of the time would be building product and getting customers, and 20% time in team building. If you ask me that question right now, my 50% of the time is in team building, hiring, just meeting people. 25% I would say on aligning the team that we have built to the mission and vision that we have, making sure that we are all running in the right direction. And then rest 20-25% of the time in firefighting, because we now have a decent scale. There is still a lot of firefighting that happens. And as a founder, as a CEO, you'll have to be on the ground with the team to make sure that one, you are able to help your team, and two, you're able to solve problems for your customers. You can't be away from what's happening on the ground.
Right. Definitely excited for my life as one day in the roles of Abhishek. Okay, so I think I do have a couple more questions. But before that, I just want to take one or two questions maybe from the audience. So there's one interesting question that's just come up. Somebody called Asim is asking this question. Did you have a plan B while entering this space, right? And was there some time or milestone that you set for yourself on this particular model, right? Because he has from the perspective of, should one really go all in, or should one have a backup plan also and work on it simultaneously? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, no, we didn't have any plan B. I am a strong believer in going all in. If you have a plan B, then you will always, you won't. I mean, it's just simple, right? You won't go all in, right? You won't give your life to it in a way, and which also means that you are not 100% sure about what you are building, right? You as a founder yourself don't have enough belief in what you're building. So no, we didn't have any plan B when we were building this.
Right. In fact, that again brings me to another principle that I live by, or of late I started living by much more, right? Like the moment you start acting from a place of fear is when you start thinking of, let's say, another plan or whatever. But the whole idea is to slowly condition your mind to act from a place of confidence that, yes, I'm going for it. I'm very confident about it. I'm very clear on the whys of it, and I will get it there.
Correct. And see, it requires, in a startup, I would say, again, the day to your previous question, the day, what does a day look like, right? As a founder, you have to be prepared, and not just founders, right? Actually, all the founding team members as well, all the team members in a startup, almost 80% of the times you will have a downtime, and 20% of the time you will have an uptime. You will have excitement, right? But those peaks are really, really exciting. Those peaks are really high, and that's what gives you the boost, right? But which means that if you're building a startup, you have to be ready for those 80% of the times when things won't go as you want. And you would have to have that passion. You would have to have that commitment. You would have to have that patience to continue with what you're building. It may require, sometimes it may fly off within a month. Sometimes it may take years, right? For example, I was talking to one of the senior leaders at SMS Gupshup yesterday, right?
Okay.
It's a company that started almost 18, 20 years ago, right? We all thought that company is dead. And I've worked with many of the senior leaders at Gupshup who had moved out from that company, right? But imagine that grit of that co-founder, and SMS Gupshup is now a unicorn. Imagine the grit of that founder, right? That's what it takes to build something really meaningful. You need to have that strong belief.
Absolutely agree with you on that. Probably one more question from the audience, and then we'll go back to my questions, which may sink in a lot of other things that the audience has asked for. So one is that, of course, so when we look at, when we at HeadStart, we evaluate startups for our various initiatives and things like that, we look at, let's say the problem that the startup is trying to solve, the market size, the founding team, all of those things, right? So the question here is that, are there any certain nuances of this fundraising world or the VC world, certain things that VCs look for which are often amiss, or which are, minute stuff, but go amiss when somebody is looking at it? Is there any such thing that you have come across which you might want to throw some light on?
No, I mean, what I have, if I have to summarize what investors look at, and especially the larger investors, what they look at is first the size of the overall market. it should be a sizable market in which you're playing, right? It can't be a market, let's say, that is $100 million overall market. So even if you are the leader in the market, and if you have 50% of the market share, which is extremely hard, but let's say if you have 50% of the market share, you are still a $50 million revenue business, right? That's not exciting for a VC, right? So you have to go after a market that is really large. One of the things that, and I think this is very well written in the YC blogs, is go after a market that has a double-digit growth, right? A lot of these markets may look really large, but may either be degrowing. I mean, it's actually shrinking, or they have a growth of 7, 8, 9%, or maybe 5%, right? Again, not very exciting. Go after market, and to give you perspective of group health insurance, group health insurance, the market has a 23, 24% CAGR year-over-year growth over the last 3 to 4 years on average, right? That's an extremely, and if you actually multiply that growth over a period of 5 years, which essentially means that your market is doubling every 5 years. That's a very high growth market, right? So even if you are in that market, which means that, let's say, if there are incumbents that are not growing to the pace, the market will grow so much that there'll be enough opportunity for new companies to take up that new market that has been created. Right? So number one is play in a market that is large and is growing rather than shrinking. Number two is you are the team that has the right to win in this market. Early on, there is nothing else, right? Early on, you don't have a product, you won't have customers as well. I mean, you will have some early customers, some early product, but again, there is very hard to say that, hey, this is the right, this is what would win, right? So what investors are looking is, hey, is this the set of founders that will have that kind of patience? They have the right problem solving skills, they have the right execution skills to build in this market for the next 10 years. They will have ups and downs, there will be a lot of failures, but they will stay on and build something really large in this market. I think those would be the two larger things that people look at an early stage. If you think about Series A, Series B kind of company, then they will start looking at your product, your traction, your execution as well, because by then you will have all of these numbers to prove as well. But early on, those are the two things that you should focus on.
Nicely put. I think that's very important, especially the market aspect is something which most of us, sort of tend to miss sometimes. So that's great. So I have, since you mentioned, you spoke about a blog, right? You spoke about the YC blog. So I did go through the website and noticed a lot of resources and content that you've put across there. So there are blogs and stuff like that. So how do you leverage these content pieces, these blogs to sort of, to scale up? Like, do you see, so, I mean, everybody does put it, but like, do you also see some benefit coming out of it? Or do you put it just out of sheer passion for the industry? What is it that goes behind that?
Yeah, no, I think it's very specific. I mean, definitely specific to our industry, but I think this is probably applicable in many other industries as well. See, in the business of insurance, you need to do three things. One is you need to build trust. Insurance is a business of trust. People won't come to you unless they start trusting you as a brand, as a company. Second, you need to build awareness, right? Insurance right now has a very low penetration, and most of the companies, for example, right now, if you look at all the customers of Plum, almost 80% of our customers are first-time buyers of insurance.
Okay, that's very interesting.
You're basically building awareness in the market that, hey, you as a company of 10 people or 50 people can actually go and buy insurance. And third, third thing that you're doing is you need to do is education, right? Insurance is a very complicated product. You need to explain, you need to simplify insurance, and you need to educate your users about what it really means to them. And for us, content is actually one of those means that is doing all of these three things at the same time. It is helping us build trust in the minds of our customers. And I can share more about that as well, but it's helping us build trust. It is helping us build awareness when people are not even subconsciously thinking about insurance. They're scrolling through their LinkedIn or Twitter and they see that, hey, oh wow, this is a 10 people company that is using insurance and they used it via Plum, right? That then it hits them that, hey, actually, why not? I can also do this for my company, right? And then we are using insurance to build that education as well. And the way it helps us is then we have to, it actually massively saves our sales cost or our marketing cost, right?
That's what
Because
I'm getting.
most of the times, if you look at the sales cost, a lot of sales goes in actually building trust or education. People are just asking hundreds of questions to the sales guy about, and these are some of the basic questions about insurance, which people can actually read through content.
Right. No, that's a very valid point, right? It definitely helps reduce your customer acquisition cost by a large number, and that's always a great saving to your top line as well. So I have one last big question. We're also sort of like approaching time, so probably another 5-10 minutes and should be there. But just one last big question, post which I have a bunch of rapid fire for you, 4-5 rapid fires, like a second each. So this question is basically, just to get some more insight on, what is it that Plum holds, or rather, what is the future holding for Plum, right? What does it look like? What is that big mission vision that you're chasing? And what do you feel is your most significant strength that's going to help you get there?
No, absolutely. So, see, we started Plum with this vision that in the next 10 years, or maybe it will take 15 years, but eventually we will have a country where everyone is insured, where everyone has access to the right quality of healthcare. And our goal is that Plum plays a significant part in that next 10 years towards that kind of country that we will build. So that's what we are all building towards. Our very first milestone is to actually scale this business to around 10 million people that are insured via Plum. Again, that's a very, very small part, right? In the population of 1.4 billion, getting 10 million is a very small number, but we have to start somewhere. But even if we get to 10 million lives insured, in a way, it will get us to being the top 3 insurance company that exist in India, right? We have to start there. And from there, hopefully that 10 million, we can grow to 100 million people that are insured. But by doing that, our goal is also to inspire many more companies that actually go and make healthcare and insurance accessible, right? We know that we can't be the only company that will do this. We won't be able to do this alone as well, right? So our goal is that we build an ecosystem on the way that helps us towards that kind of country where we have a very, very high penetration of health insurance. What's our strength? I would say we are getting there. We are not yet there. But see, to build a really successful business in insurance, you have to build a very, very high amount of trust. I think that's the only sustainable advantage that you can build over a very long period of time in the business of insurance. And that's what we are building towards, right? And how do you build trust? You build trust by ensuring that you are giving a very high quality claims experience. It's very easy to get money early on, but eventually the question is, what's the kind of experience that the employees or the family members had when they were at the hospital or when they tried to make a claim, right? And that's a metric that we optimize for. The metric that we measure at Plum is called claims net promoter score, claims NPS. And our NPS score is around 78, 79 right now, which is almost 2x of what the next best would be in the industry. And we hope that we are always stay at that kind of level. Our goal is always to stay at 80 plus kind of score.
Nice. Very interesting. I think a lot of people had questions about, how do you see the insurance market grow? Where do you see it going? How is it placed from an international perspective? And I think a lot of what you said just now covered a lot of those answers as well. Okay, so now moving on to to the last and final round of this really exciting conversation is the rapid fire, right? So I'm just gonna head right into it, and probably you can just give the answers. So mountains or beaches?
Beaches.
Okay. Mangoes or plums?
Plums, of course.
Is it because of insurance or is it because of the fruit?
It's because of the fruit.
Oh, that's very
and
nice.
Insurance as well. Now insurance as well.
Okay. What is your most favorite eat out and where is it located?
Most favorite eat out. Actually, it's MTR. But
oh, lovely.
More MTRs and many MTRs.
MTR is home.
Yeah, I don't care about which MTR is. Every MTR is.
Yeah, MTR is pretty much, yeah, that's lovely. Okay, what was your most recent read the most recent read that you enjoyed the most or learned from the most? Something?
Yeah, this is a book on Netflix culture. No rules, I think. Yeah.
Okay. What's called No
Rules?
Recommended
if you're thinking about building a company and if you're building about how to build that team and culture, definitely recommended.
Could you just spell it out in the chat for the audience?
Yes. I think it's No Rules.
Great. Okay. Okay. Who is this one person who has inspired you the most?
That would be my dad, actually.
Lovely.
It's and that's because of the kind of patience he has, especially raising a family. And then, I mean, we come from a very, very middle-class family. He has gone through a lot, come from a very small tier 3 town in India. I've seen all of that, right? Seen the kind of struggles that he has gone through, and he has raised 6 sisters, actually, almost on his own.
Wow. That's crazy.
It's been really inspirational, and a lot of that patience that I talked about, I think, comes from seeing him.
Nice. That's such a nicely put answer. In fact, sometimes I think to myself as well, right? When you just look above, you just look out, you look at your parents. That's a lot of inspiration you can draw from them, especially the generation in which we are. So that's great. There's one last rapid fire which somebody had asked on the chat. It could be kind of controversial, but any which ways. Time frame that Plum is targeting to cover 10 million people. You may choose to answer that.
No, yeah, 2024. That's a company stated goal.
Great stuff. Okay, great. Abhishek, thank you so much. I had a lot of fun hosting you. I hope it was likewise for you. And there was a lot of questions coming from the audience. I've tried my best to cover how much I could, but my apologies if I missed out certain things. Can they reach out to you on LinkedIn if they have some questions? They can probably ping
Absolutely.
you if you put some
absolutely. I'll just put my email ID as well here.
Yeah. If you sent the name of the book, it didn't come on the chat.
Oh, I just realized it went to some direct message. 1 second.
Okay. Yeah. So I think.
So that's my email ID, and the name of the book is No Rules.
Great. Lovely. Thank you so much, Abhishek. Lovely connecting with you. We'll stay in touch. And thank you so much for everybody who joined. Thank you for making it interactive, for staying all through the session. And I really hope you liked it. I really hope you liked it. I don't know why I'm lip syncing. But anyway, thank you so much. It was lovely hosting you guys. Bye.
Thank you, Pranay. Thanks so much for the amazing session.